My name is Claire Mitchell. I am 32 years old, and for most of my life, Christmas meant family food and a little peace after a long year. That was what I expected when I packed a small gift and flew home from Chicago. But the moment I walked into our house in Sugar House, something felt off. My sister looked startled to see me. My mother kept exchanging strange glances, and I could not shake the feeling that I was interrupting a secret I was never supposed to uncover. Then, as we sat around the table with candles flickering and neighbors whispering, my mother suddenly set down her fork and asked me about $200,000 she claimed she had given me. My hands froze, my heart stopped, and my sister's face drained of color. Why would she lie to keep me away, and why would my own mother confront me like that in front of everyone? Stay with me, and I will tell you how one holiday dinner turned into the night that changed everything I thought I knew about family. Let me take you back to where it began. Snow was falling softly as the plane touched down in Salt Lake City, and by the time I pulled into Sugar House, the world looked as if it had been wrapped in a white blanket. The houses on my parents' street glowed with strings of colored lights, some twinkling, some steady, each front porch lined with wreaths and red bows. My breath clouded in the crisp air as I carried a small gift bag from the trunk of my rental car. Inside was a silver-framed photo of me with my parents from years ago, something I thought they might smile at during the holidays. It felt simple but heartfelt, and after months of working long hours in Chicago, it was the best way I knew to remind them I was still part of this family. My stomach fluttered as I walked up the path to the house I had grown up in. It was warm inside. I could see through the frosted windows the golden light spilling onto the snow. The sound of muffled laughter carried through the door. I hesitated for a second, brushing the flakes from my coat, wondering why I felt so nervous. It was Christmas Eve, and yet a part of me braced for the familiar undercurrent of tension that always seemed to creep in during family gatherings. When I opened the door, the rush of warmth and smells hit me all at once. The scent of roasted turkey mingled with nutmeg and cinnamon from freshly baked gingerbread. The tree stood in the corner of the living room, decked with red and gold ornaments, tinsel draped like strands of ice. Presents filled the space underneath, wrapped in shiny paper and topped with neat bows. I stepped in, pulling off my gloves, and instantly voices rose in greeting. Dad came first, taller than I remembered, his gray hair catching the glow of the tree lights. He hugged me tightly, clapping my back as if I had been gone for years rather than months. "You made it," he said, his voice full of warmth. Behind him, Mom turned from arranging a platter of deviled eggs, her face lighting up in a practiced smile. She walked over, kissed my cheek, and took the gift bag from my hand before I could explain. "You did not have to, Claire," she said softly, already turning back toward the kitchen. I set my suitcase by the stairs, trying to ignore the quick exchange of glances between my parents. The chatter of relatives and neighbors filled the house. The dining table was already set with red napkins, folded into triangles, candles flickering in the center. The air felt festive, but there was something else too, a subtle tightness in the way people moved and how my mother's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Then Kristen appeared at the top of the stairs. She was glowing, or maybe that was just the light bouncing off the sequins on her emerald dress. Her hair was styled in loose curls, and on her wrist glittered a gold bracelet so new it practically screamed from across the room. She walked down slowly, savoring the attention, her Chanel purse dangling from her arm. "Well, if it isn't our Chicago star," she said, her tone light but sharp enough to sting. She leaned forward to kiss my cheek, her perfume overwhelming, then pulled back just far enough to flash her hand in front of me. The diamond caught the light from the chandelier, a large stone set in a brand new ring. "Do you like it, Claire?" she asked loudly enough for several people nearby to turn their heads. I smiled politely, though my chest tightened. "It is beautiful," I said. Kristen laughed, the sound brittle, and tucked her hand against her hip as if to show it off again. Dad called out for everyone to help themselves to drinks, and a cluster of neighbors shifted toward the bar set up near the fireplace. Kristen stayed close, her eyes scanning me up and down, as if trying to measure whether I noticed the latest addition to her growing collection of luxuries. I moved toward the kitchen, hoping to escape the scrutiny, but my mother's voice floated after me, careful, measured, telling Kristen not to block the hallway. Kristen rolled her eyes but stepped aside, still smiling like she was on stage. The room was alive with chatter, laughter, the clinking of glasses, but beneath it all I could feel the quiet thrum of something unsaid. As I took a glass of water and stood near the tree watching the lights blink in a slow rhythm, I told myself this was just the usual holiday tension, nothing more. Still, the way Kristen flaunted her purse, and her ring, the way Mom's eyes darted away when I caught her gaze, made me wonder what kind of Christmas this was going to be. And for the first time that night I realized I was holding my breath, waiting for something I could not yet name. Chicago had hardened me in ways I never admitted to my family. The winters were sharp, the deadlines even sharper, and the office where I worked seemed to thrive on competition rather than collaboration. I had spent nearly 8 years climbing the rungs at a mid-sized fashion marketing firm, pitching campaigns to clients who often looked right through me until my ideas turned into results they could not ignore. It was fast-paced, exhausting, and sometimes lonely. Yet I clung to it because I wanted to prove I could build something without leaning on anyone else. There were mornings when I stood in front of the mirror in my small apartment near Lakeview, smoothing my blazer, telling myself that today would be different, that today I would finally get credit instead of having my work swept under the rug by someone louder. But credit was hard to come by. My coworkers, especially a few who had been there longer, had no problem whispering about me in the break room. When word got around that my mother had wired me $800,000 to start a boutique, the whispers grew into smirks. I remember one afternoon in the office kitchen. I was pouring coffee when Stephanie from the social team leaned against the counter, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Must be nice to have a personal investor," she said, stirring her tea without looking at me. "Guess some of us will just keep grinding while others played dress-up with Mom's money." A couple of her friends chuckled, not even trying to hide it. My face burned, but I forced a smile, saying I still had to work like everyone else. Inside, I wanted to scream that I had earned my place, that my family money did not erase the nights I spent at my desk past 10 o'clock. It stung not because they were entirely wrong, but because they refused to see the full truth. My mother had given me that money with no strings, telling me it was my chance to create something of my own. What they did not know was that she had also promised an additional $200,000 to both me and my sister, separate from the boutique money, for whatever future we dreamed. I had never seen that account, never touched a cent of it. I assumed it was still sitting somewhere safe, waiting for the right moment. The thought of that money was complicated. On the one hand, it felt like a cushion, a safety net I could fall back on if the boutique failed. On the other, it felt like a weight, something I could be accused of leaning on, instead of proving my own strength. I never told my colleagues about the second promise, and I never asked my mother why I had not seen it. It was easier to focus on the tangible gift, the $800,000, and the plan I was slowly piecing together. Nights in Chicago often ended with me, hunched over my laptop sketching layouts for the boutique, imagining racks of clothing under warm lights, customers browsing pieces that carried my stamp of taste. I scouted locations online, even flew to Salt Lake City once to look at storefronts near downtown. The rent made my stomach tighten, but I told myself I would find a way. It had to be more than a dream. The office politics only pushed me harder. Each time a coworker made a snide remark, I sharpened my resolve. One evening, after a tense client meeting where my manager praised another team member for a concept I had pitched, I went home and worked until 2 a.m. on my own vision board for the boutique. I taped magazine clippings to the wall, wrote numbers on sticky notes, and reminded myself that soon I would not have to beg anyone to see my worth. Chicago had been good to me in some ways. It taught me to survive, to keep moving even when I was overlooked. But it also made me realize how desperately I wanted to create something that was mine alone. The boutique was not just about fashion. It was about reclaiming the years I spent being dismissed. It was about showing everyone, including my family, that I could stand on my own. I carried that determination with me as I left the city for Christmas. Sitting on the plains, staring out at the frozen landscape below, I promised myself I would not be defined by money, gifted or withheld. The boutique would rise because I poured myself into it, not because anyone handed me a free pass. That promise settled deep inside me, stronger than the sting of gossip or the shadow of my sister's glamorous lifestyle. As I stood in my parents' living room that Christmas Eve, the smell of gingerbread lingering in the air, Kristen's diamonds flashing under the chandelier, I reminded myself of that vow. Whatever games were unfolding in this house, whatever secrets made the air feel heavier than it should, I was not the same woman who had once shrunk under coworkers' whispers. I was ready to face whatever came, even if I had no idea yet what it would be. It had only been a week earlier when the first crack appeared, the phone call that unsettled me before I even packed a bag. I was in my apartment in Chicago, curled up on the couch with a notebook full of boutique sketches, when my phone lit up with Kristen's name. I almost didn't answer because our conversations were rarely pleasant, but curiosity won. Her voice was clipped, almost rehearsed. "Mom isn't feeling well," she said quickly, "so the Christmas dinner is off this year. No need to come home, Claire." She made it sound final, like she was doing me a favor by saving me the trip. I sat up straight, confused. Off as in cancelled. Kristen, Dad has been talking about Christmas dinner since October. He practically plans the menu before the leaves even fall. She laughed lightly, the kind of laugh people use when they hope it hides something. "It's just a cold. He doesn't want a big fuss, that's all. Trust me. Stay in Chicago, enjoy yourself." Her tone did not match the words. It was too hurried, too eager to close the subject. My chest tightened. I asked to talk to Mom, but Kristen claimed she was resting. Then I asked to talk to Dad. Kristen brushed it aside, saying he was busy. The call ended with her insisting I keep the plane ticket money in my pocket. I sat there staring at the phone long after the line went dead. My parents never canceled Christmas. Even during years when money was tight, when Dad was working overtime at the construction company and Mom was juggling her office job, they still set the table, baked pies, and insisted we gather. Christmas in our house was sacred. The unease grew until I could not keep it inside. I dialed Aunt Caroline, my mother's sister, the one person who never sugarcoated anything. She picked up on the second ring, cheerful as always. I asked how Mom was feeling. There was a pause, then she laughed. "Fine, as far as I know. I was at the house yesterday. Your mom was fussing over the cranberry sauce and your dad was in the backyard stringing lights like he was 20 years younger." I pressed the phone harder to my ear. "So the dinner isn't canceled?" Caroline sounded puzzled. "Canceled, honey. They've been inviting half the neighborhood. Your mom already ordered the turkey." The knot in my stomach turned to something sharper. Kristen had lied. Not just a little fib, but a deliberate effort to keep me away. Caroline must have sensed the shift in my voice, because she asked if everything was all right between me and my sister. I swallowed hard, said I would explain later, and thanked her for telling me the truth. After hanging up, I paced my living room. The city lights outside my window blurred through the frost, but I barely noticed. All I could think about was why Kristen would lie about something so basic. I tried to come up with innocent explanations. Maybe she wanted more time with our parents. Maybe she thought I was too busy in Chicago. But the memory of her voice, so forced and unnatural, told me otherwise. By midnight, I was online searching flights. My heart pounded as I clicked through options. A ticket for Christmas Eve morning popped up, expensive but not impossible. I booked it without hesitation. At work the next day, I avoided small talk, keeping my focus on the campaign drafts on my desk. But my mind kept drifting back to Kristen. I thought about the last few times I had seen her. She was always dressed in something flashy, a different designer handbag hanging from her arm, each visit a trip to Europe on her lips. Where was all that money coming from? She never held a steady job, never seemed worried about bills. I remembered the way she borrowed my clothes in high school, without asking, how she smiled sweetly at our parents, and somehow always got her way. By the time I packed my suitcase in the days before Christmas, the doubts had hardened into suspicion. I folded sweaters and tucked in the small photo frame I had bought for my parents, all the while hearing Kristen's voice telling me to stay in Chicago. She had not wanted me there, and I was determined to find out why. The flight itself was uneventful, a blur of crying children and overhead announcements, but my mind never stopped racing. When the plane descended into Salt Lake City, I pressed my forehead against the window, looking down at the valley dusted with snow. My heart thudded with a mixture of dread and defiance. Whatever Kristen was hiding, I would not give her the satisfaction of succeeding. As the cab carried me toward Sugar House, I thought about Aunt Caroline's laugh on the phone about the way she had described my parents bustling with holiday spirit. It clashed so sharply with Kristen's story of sickness and cancellation that I knew something larger was brewing. When the house finally came into view, the roof lined with glowing lights and the driveway crowded with cars, I felt both relief and anger. Relief that Mom and Dad were fine, that Christmas was alive in the Mitchell house. Anger that Kristen had tried to keep me away, as if my presence would ruin some secret she was desperate to protect. I paid the driver, stepped into the snowy yard, and tightened my scarf. The laughter and music spilling from inside were unmistakable. Kristen's lie had been bold, almost brazen, and standing there, my suitcase in hand, I realized this Christmas would not be like any before. It was only the beginning of something I could not yet see, but I knew I had made the right choice by coming home. The driveway was lined with cars, their roofs dusted in snow, and warm light spilled from every window of the house. I dragged my suitcase up the walk, the familiar crunch of frozen gravel under my boots, making me feel both nostalgic and nervous. Before I could knock, the door opened, and a burst of music and chatter rushed out along with the smell of roasted turkey and cloves. Dad stood there, his cheeks flushed from the heat inside and the whiskey in his glass. His grin widened the moment he saw me. "Claire, you made it," he said, pulling me into a hug so tight I could barely breathe. He smelled faintly of pine and aftershave, and for a second, I felt like I was 10 years old again, safe in his arms. Behind him, the living room was packed. Neighbors from down the block, a couple of Dad's old co-workers' cousins I had not seen in years, all gathered in groups around the fire or near the dining table. Everyone was laughing, glasses and hand plates already full of appetizers. The tree glittered in the corner ornaments, catching the light, and piles of wrapped gifts threatened to spill out across the rug. Then I saw Mom. She was arranging a tray of cookies on the sideboard, her back straight, her hair pulled into the kind of neat bun she wore when she wanted to look composed. Her head turned when she heard Dad's voice, and for the briefest moment her eyes widened in surprise. She set down the tray quickly, her smile forming a second too late, and hurried toward me. "You didn't say you were coming," she said, her tone warm but edged with something sharper. I leaned in for her kiss, feeling her lips brush my cheek, and I knew she was trying to hide her shock. Before I could answer, movement at the staircase caught my attention. Kristen was descending slowly, her hand grazing the polished banister, as if she were walking a runway. Her emerald dress shimmered in the soft light, and her heels clicked against the wood. She froze for a split second when her eyes landed on me. Her face betrayed something between irritation and disbelief, then smoothed into a smile so bright it looked rehearsed. "Claire," she said, her voice pitched high enough for the nearest guest to hear. "What a surprise!" I forced my own smile and set my suitcase against the wall. "I couldn't miss Christmas," I replied, though the words felt heavier than they should. She glided the rest of the way down, her gold bracelet slipping into view as she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. Her purse dangled from her shoulder, the unmistakable quilted leather of Chanel. The diamond ring on her finger caught the chandelier's glow as she reached for a glass of wine from a passing tray. It was a performance, every gesture precise, designed to be noticed. Dad, oblivious to the undercurrents, took my coat and hung it on the rack by the door. He clapped my shoulder and led me further into the room, introducing me to a few people I already knew, people who seemed genuinely happy I had come. I accepted a glass of water and tried to relax, but my eyes kept drifting back to Mom and Kristen. Mom stood near the kitchen doorway now, speaking quietly to a neighbor, but her gaze flickered toward me every few seconds, quick and measuring. Kristen mingled with a group of women near the fire, laughing too loudly, her hands moving animatedly as she talked. When she caught me watching, her smile faltered just slightly, then she turned her back. I tried to shake off the tension. After all, it was Christmas Eve and the house was alive with music and chatter. But as I made small talk with a cousin about the snowstorm that had delayed flights earlier that week, I could feel the weight of unspoken words pressing in from across the room. Dad called everyone to raise their glasses for a quick toast, thanking friends and family for being there, and for a moment the warmth of his voice filled the house. People clinked glasses, laughter rang out again, and I took a sip of water to steady myself. Yet even then I felt it. The subtle chill in the way Mom's eyes lingered on me, the stiffness in Kristen's movements, as if my arrival had thrown off a plan I was not supposed to interrupt. As I stood there, candlelight flickering across the dining table, I realized this was more than holiday nerves. Something was buried beneath the sparkle and cheer, and no one was going to admit it easily. The truth was hiding in the glances between my mother and sister, and I could feel it waiting for the right moment to surface. Laughter swelled in the living room as someone told a story about slipping on the icy driveway, but my eyes kept straying to the corner where Mom and Kristen stood shoulder to shoulder. Their heads bent close, lips moving quickly. Then they would straighten and glance around as if checking to see who was watching. The moment my gaze landed on them, they looked away, Kristen sipping her wine, Mom fussing with the tray of cookies she had already arranged twice. I tried to stay engaged with the small talk around me, nodding at a neighbor's comment about the coldest December in years, but the weight in my chest grew heavier. It was the same feeling I had on the phone when Kristen told me to stay in Chicago, like the air had shifted, and I was not supposed to notice. I made my way toward the kitchen, needing a moment to breathe, and nearly collided with Aunt Caroline. She steadied me with her hand, her eyes sharp as always. "You look pale," she said softly. "Everything all right?" I forced a smile. "Just tired from the flight." She gave me a look that told me she did not believe me. "Come with me," she whispered, tugging me gently toward the hallway near the pantry. The music was muffled there, the chatter fading, and I felt like we had stepped into a pocket of honesty away from the performance in the other room. Caroline leaned closer, her voice low. "Have you noticed your sister lately? She has been spending like crazy. Last week I saw her at the mall with 3 shopping bags from Chanel, and she was showing off a new pair of diamond earrings. She bragged to someone about a quick trip to Paris in the fall. And did you see the car out front, that white Lexus parked at the curb that is hers? She just bought it." The words landed hard. Kristen had always loved the appearance of luxury, but she had never had the means to sustain it. Growing up, she borrowed my sweaters, borrowed my makeup, anything to look more polished. Yet now, she was dripping in designer goods, taking trips across the ocean, driving a car that cost more than most people's houses in this neighborhood. I shook my head, trying to process. How is she affording all of this? Caroline's mouth tightened. "That is what I want to know. And your mother, she has been too quiet about it, almost protective. Something is not right, Claire." I felt my pulse in my ears. My mind drifted to a memory from a few months back, sitting in my apartment in Chicago, scrolling through my bank app. Buried deep in the transaction history was a transfer I did not recognize. The details were vague, just a reference number, nothing clear. At the time I dismissed it, thinking maybe it was a system error or a late posting. Now, standing in that narrow hallway with my aunt's voice cutting through the fog, the unease came roaring back. I remembered asking Kristen during one of our rare phone calls how she was managing her bills. She had laughed, said something about freelancing and online gigs, brushing it off like it was beneath explanation. Back then, I wanted to believe her. But tonight, the puzzle pieces began to fit in ways I did not want them to. I glanced back toward the living room. Kristen was at the center of a small group, her hands moving gracefully, as she described some restaurant in New York she had been to. Mom hovered nearby, pretending to adjust the tablecloth, but never far from her eldest daughter. Their bodies angled subtly toward one another, a silent alliance in a crowded room. My chest tightened. Kristen's lie about the dinner being canceled, her sudden wealth, the mysterious transaction in my account, and now Mom's strange protectiveness. It was too much to ignore. Aunt Caroline touched my arm gently. "I know you do not want drama, especially tonight, but keep your eyes open. Your sister is hiding something, and I do not think it is small." I nodded, my throat dry. "Thank you," I whispered, though the words felt thin compared to the weight pressing against my ribs. As we stepped back into the glow of the living room, the voices rose again, glasses clinking, the smell of turkey wafting in from the kitchen. On the surface, it was the picture of Christmas warmth, but underneath I could feel it unraveling. Every laugh seemed forced, every smile too wide. Kristen caught my eye from across the room. For a brief second, her expression shifted, the smile slipping, her eyes narrowing as if she knew Caroline and I had been talking. Then as quickly as it came, the mask returned. She lifted her glass in a casual toast to someone beside her, her ring flashing like a signal. I looked away, gripping the edge of a chair to steady myself. My mind was racing, now connecting dots I wished would stay scattered. The lie, the spending, the transaction, Mom's silence. It all pointed in one direction, one I could no longer pretend not to see. And as the music swelled and voices filled the house again, I felt the first real wave of certainty crash over me. Kristen was hiding something bigger than a shopping spree, and Mom was helping her keep it quiet. Dinner began the way it always had, plates passed around the table, the sound of silverware clinking, voices rising and falling as stories were shared. The candles flickered against the china, casting soft light across smiling faces. For a moment, it almost felt like the Christmases I remembered, warm and ordinary, everyone too busy reaching for mashed potatoes or gravy to dwell on anything else. I sat between Dad and Aunt Caroline, cutting into the turkey on my plate, trying to let the comfort of tradition settle me. Dad leaned toward me, whispering something about how Mom had outdone herself with the stuffing this year, and I smiled, grateful for his steadiness. Across the table, Kristen laughed at something. One of the neighbors said, her hand brushing against her wineglass, the diamond on her finger catching the candlelight. Mom sat beside her, composed, her eyes moving around the table, cataloging every detail. Then it happened. Mom's fork clattered softly as she placed it beside her plate. She folded her hands, lifted her head, and her gaze locked on me. The chatter died almost instantly, though no one could explain why. It was as if her eyes pulled the air out of the room. "Claire," she said, her voice steady, almost formal. "The $200,000 I sent you, what have you done with it?" My heart stopped. I stared at her, the words echoing in my head like a foreign language. $200,000 sent to me. My knife slipped from my hand and landed against the edge of my plate with a sharp clang. "I never received anything," I stammered, my throat tightening. "What do you mean?" The table went silent. All around me, people froze, forks halfway to their mouths, conversations cut short. Aunt Caroline's glass hovered just below her lips, her eyes narrowing as she looked between me and Mom. Across the table, Kristen's smile collapsed. Color drained from her cheeks as her hand trembled, nearly tipping her wine. She set it down too quickly, the glass knocking against the table, a drop of red spilling onto the white cloth. Dad looked stunned, his brows pulling together. "Margaret, what are you talking about?" he said quietly. Mom didn't look at him. Her eyes stayed on me, sharp and unyielding. "I wired it directly, Claire. 200,000 separate from the money for your boutique. I wanted you to have your share, just like your sister." I shook my head, my palms damp against the napkin in my lap. "Mom, I swear I never saw it. The only money you gave me was the 800,000 for the boutique. That's all." Kristen shifted in her seat, her hand clutching the edge of the table. Everyone could see it now, the way her shoulders tightened, the way her eyes darted toward Mom as if pleading for a lifeline. Guests whispered. A neighbor coughed awkwardly, setting down his fork. The candles sputtered in the draft, throwing shadows across the tense faces. Mom's voice cut through the silence again, cold and deliberate. "Claire, are you saying you didn't receive it?" I forced myself to meet her gaze. "Number, I never did. If I had, I would tell you." Dad leaned back, rubbing his jaw. His eyes flicked from me to Kristen, then back to Mom. The tension in the room was so heavy I could feel it pressing against my skin. Kristen's hand shook as she reached for her napkin, dabbing at the spot of wine on the tablecloth. It was a useless gesture, more about avoiding eye contact than cleaning up. Her lips parted as if she might say something, but no sound came. Aunt Caroline set her glass down with a sharp click. The entire table turned toward Kristen then, as if some collective instinct recognized where the truth was hiding. Mom exhaled slowly, her eyes narrowing. Her voice was quiet now, but each word was clear. "Someone took it. And I want to know who." No one moved. I sat frozen in my chair, the weight of her words crashing over me. I had come home expecting tension, maybe an argument, but not this. Not a public accusation, not numbers so large they echoed in my head like thunder. Kristen finally spoke, her voice thin and uneven. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe the bank mixed something up. But her hands told the story better than her words. They trembled against the white linen, and when she caught me staring, her face went pale as paper. The guests shifted, some glancing toward the door as if wondering whether they should excuse themselves. But no one left. Everyone was too stunned, too entangled now in whatever storm had just begun. I could feel my father's arm brush mine as he leaned forward, his voice low but firm. "Claire, just tell us the truth." I met his eyes, desperate for him to believe me. "Dad, I am telling the truth. I never got it. Not a dollar." The silence stretched heavy and suffocating until the only sound left was the faint hum of Christmas music still playing from the speaker in the corner, absurd against the tension gripping the room. Mom folded her napkin with deliberate care, her face unreadable. Kristen avoided my gaze entirely, her hand gripping the stem of her wine glass like it was the only thing holding her upright. And that was how the joy of Christmas dinner cracked open, leaving nothing but the echo of a question no one could answer, and the certainty that this night had shifted into something we would all remember for the rest of our lives. Kristen's chair scraped against the floor as she leaned forward, her voice trembling but loud enough for the entire table. Maybe it was a banking error. These things happen. Or maybe Claire forgot. She has been busy in Chicago, right? She let out a shaky laugh that died in the heavy silence. My stomach clenched. Forgot $200,000. The absurdity of it made my skin crawl. I opened my mouth to respond, but Mom beat me to it. "Enough." Her tone was sharp, her hand steady as she reached into the drawer of the sideboard beside her. She pulled out a folded stack of papers and laid them on the table with a deliberate motion. The sound of the paper against the wood cut through the stillness like a blade. "I know what I sent," Margaret said. She unfolded the top sheet and slid it across the table toward Dad, her eyes never leaving Kristen. "Here is the transfer. The recipient name is Claire, but look at the account number." Dad adjusted his glasses, frowning as he scanned the page. He passed it to Aunt Caroline, who let out a low whistle. "That's Kristen's account." My breath caught. I reached for the paper, hands trembling, and there it was in black and white. The money had been wired with my name as the intended recipient, but the digits beneath matched an account I recognized. Kristen had used it before when Mom gave us both access years back for smaller family expenses. Kristen's face drained of color. She reached across the table, snatching for the papers, but Aunt Caroline pulled them back out of reach. "That is mine, Kristen," said her voice rising. "It must be some mix-up." Aunt Caroline's eyes narrowed. "A mix-up that paid for a trip to Paris. A mix-up that bought you that Lexus parked outside." Her voice carried over the table, firm and cutting. The room erupted into hushed murmurs. Neighbors shifted in their chairs, glancing at one another, some openly staring at Kristen's jewelry. Her bracelet glinted mockingly under the chandelier, every sparkle another nail in her story. Kristen shook her head, her curls brushing against her shoulders as she tried to recover. "You do not understand. I was going to replace it. I thought Claire would not notice right away." Gasps rippled down the table. Dad's hand slammed against the wood, rattling the silverware. "You took her money." His voice was raw, filled with disbelief and fury. I stared at my sister, words stuck in my throat. This was the girl who used to steal my sweaters, who had lied to me countless times about borrowing and returning things. But this was not just petty theft. This was my future stolen before I had a chance to touch it. Aunt Caroline placed the papers flat on the table, her voice steady but firm. "I saw her at the mall, Margaret. Thousands of dollars on handbags, jewelry, designer coats. She was bragging about Paris. You cannot tell me this was anything but deliberate." The whispers grew louder now, guests leaning toward one another. I caught phrases like unbelievable and shameful. The weight of their judgment filled the room until it pressed against my chest. Kristen's hands trembled as she reached for her wine glass again, but this time she missed, knocking it sideways. Red wine bled across the tablecloth, spreading like a wound. She gasped, fumbling for a napkin, her composure unraveling with every frantic motion. Mom's face was pale, her jaw set. She looked between me and Kristen, her lips pressed into a thin line. For the first time all evening, her eyes betrayed fear. Dad rose halfway from his chair, pointing at the papers still in Caroline's hand. That money was meant for Claire. You knew it. You took it anyway. Kristen dropped the napkin, her shoulders slumping. Tears welled in her eyes, smudging the mascara she had so carefully applied. I just wanted a chance too, she whispered, her voice barely audible. But no one reached to comfort her. The only sound was the low murmur of guests, their eyes darting between the sisters, between the mother who had stood silent too long, and the father whose fury seemed to fill the space. My pulse thundered in my ears. The truth was out now, written across paper, confirmed by the life Kristen had been flaunting. There was no hiding anymore, no more excuses that could mask what had been done. As the wine stain spread wider across the cloth, the room turned its gaze fully on Kristen. Conversations stopped, forks and knives lay untouched. Every eye bore into her, and the silence that followed was louder than any accusation could ever be. Kristen's lips trembled before the first sob broke free. She pressed her palms against her face, but it was no use. The tears came fast, streaking her makeup and leaving black smudges under her eyes. I am sorry, she cried, her voice cracked and desperate. I only borrowed it. I thought Claire didn't need it right away. I was going to put it back. The words cut into me like glass. Borrowed. As if $200,000 were something you could borrow like a sweater and return when convenient. My throat burned, but I could not look away. Mom's hand gripped the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles blanched. Her eyes darted between me and Kristen, wide with horror, and for once the mask of control slipped. She whispered almost to herself, I gave her access. Her voice cracked as she spoke louder. I thought it was safe. I thought she would be responsible. The room buzzed with disbelief. Neighbors exchanged looks, some shaking their heads, others whispering behind hands. The betrayal wasn't only Kristen's now. My mother had handed her the keys and looked the other way. Dad rose to his full height, his chair screeching against the floorboards. His face was flushed, his jaw clenched, and when he spoke, his voice carried through the house like a hammer on steel. Enough. I cannot forgive this kind of betrayal. The guests jolted at the power in his words. Kristen flinched, burying her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with sobs. Mom stood frozen, her mouth opening, but no words coming out. The weight of his anger filled every corner of the room. I felt my pulse thudding in my ears. This was the man who always softened arguments, who smoothed over conflicts with jokes or gentle advice. I had never heard him speak like this. His fury was righteous and final, and it made the air tremble. A neighbor rose quietly from his chair, setting down his fork. I think we should go, he muttered to his wife, who nodded quickly. Within moments, 2 more couples followed, slipping toward the door with murmured apologies, unwilling to watch the Mitchell family unravel any further. The sound of coats being lifted from the rack and boots stomping against the mat echoed faintly over the stunned silence at the table. Kristen looked up, her eyes, swollen streaks of mascara trailing down her cheeks. Dad, please, she begged, her voice breaking. I only wanted a chance too. You always give Claire everything. My chest tightened, heat rising to my face. That isn't true, I said sharply, my voice trembling with equal parts rage and disbelief. You lied. You stole. Don't you dare twist this into me being the reason. Her mouth opened, then closed. She had no defense, nothing but tears. Mom reached out her hand, hovering as if to comfort Kristen, but she stopped short, the weight of judgment around her too heavy. Aunt Caroline's voice broke through, clear and cutting. A chance doesn't mean stealing from your own sister, Kristen. And you, Margaret, what were you thinking, giving her access? Mom pressed her lips together, her eyes glistening. I thought I was helping, she whispered. I thought I was keeping peace. Dad slammed his hand against the table, the plates rattling. Peace? You call this peace? Look around, Margaret. Look at what you have allowed. The words hung in the air like a verdict. Kristen sobbed harder, her shoulders slumped in defeat. Mom stood rigid, pale, unable to meet anyone's eyes. The neighbors who remained sat stiffly, their faces tight with discomfort, some avoiding my gaze, others watching with a kind of grim fascination. It was no longer just a family argument. It was a public scandal unfolding under the glow of Christmas lights and candle flames. I wanted to run to escape the suffocating room, but I stayed rooted to my chair, my hands trembling in my lap. The truth was laid bare now, and no one could pretend otherwise. Dad's voice dropped lower but still firm. This house will never be the same, not after this. The last of the guests rose quietly, gathering coats and scarves. Their footsteps faded down the hall, the front door clicking shut behind them. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by Kristen's ragged breaths and the faint crackle of the fire in the hearth. And in that silence, the weight of everything settled fully on my shoulders. Christmas was over. What remained was something raw and unforgiving, a fracture that could never be hidden again. Dad was the first to move. His chair scraped loudly against the hardwood as he stood pulling his phone from his pocket, with a steadiness that made the rest of us freeze. Kristen sobbed into her hands, "Mom," whispering her name as if she could hold the moment back, but Dad's voice cut through with quiet finality. "I am calling the police." The words dropped like stones into the silence. My pulse raced, my breath caught, but I knew there was no turning back. He spoke calmly to the dispatcher, giving our address in Sugar House, explaining in clipped sentences that his daughter had taken funds that were not hers. His voice did not shake once. Kristen lurched forward, grabbing his arm. "Dad, please no. It was a mistake. I can fix it. I will sell the car, the jewelry, I will give it back." He shook her off, his eyes burning with something I had never seen before. "You do not get to decide what fixing it looks like anymore." Mom stood too, reaching for the phone in his hand. "Daniel, do not do this. She is your daughter. Think about what this will do to our family." He turned to her, his voice like steel. "Family does not steal from family, Margaret. Family does not cover it up either." I sat frozen, my hands clenched around my napkin. Part of me wanted to cry, another part wanted to scream, but mostly I felt hollow. The police were on their way. This was real. It did not take long. The flashing lights outside painted the snow red and blue, casting strange shadows across the living room walls. 2 officers stepped in their boots, wet from the slush, their faces unreadable. Dad explained quickly, handing over the transfer papers Aunt Caroline had kept. The officers listened, nodding, then turned to me. "Miss Mitchell, can you confirm you never received this money?" My voice was tight, but I forced it steady. "I never saw it. I never touched a dollar of it." They jotted notes, then asked Kristen to stand. She hesitated, glancing desperately at Mom, but one officer's hand motion left no room for refusal. Tears streaked her cheeks as she rose, her knees wobbling. Mom immediately stepped forward, her voice pleading. She did not mean it. She thought she could pay it back. "Please, this is Christmas." The older officer shook his head slightly. "Ma'am, theft of this amount is not a misunderstanding. It is felony theft in Utah. 2nd degree. The words landed with a thud in the pit of my stomach. "Up to 15 years, he added quietly, though sentencing varies. The room spun slightly. I heard Kristen's muffled sobs, Mom's protests, the officer's calm but firm instructions. My aunt's hand touched my shoulder, gently grounding me as I sat in shock. They led Kristen toward the door, her heels slipping against the wood floor. Mom tried to follow, her voice breaking, but one officer turned to her. "We will need you to come in too, ma'am. Your involvement will be reviewed." Her face went pale, her body stiffening as she looked back at Dad. "You told them I was involved." Dad did not flinch. "You gave her access. You lied to me." The officers guided both of them outside. The cold air rushed in as the door opened, carrying with it the distant hum of the neighborhood still lit with Christmas lights. I sat staring at the wine stain on the tablecloth, the room suddenly enormous and empty. Dad remained standing, his shoulders rigid, his jaw tight. Aunt Caroline moved to clear plates that no one had touched since the moment Mom first spoke my name, her movements quiet and mechanical. The silence pressed and broken only by the faint crackle of the fire. My chest ached as I tried to process what had just unfolded. Kristen, my sister, let out in tears. My mother, her face pale with shock, escorted alongside her. The officer's words echoed in my ears. Felony theft. 2nd degree. 15 years. I could not reconcile the gravity of it with the image of my sister parading her new purse earlier that evening, or my mother carefully arranging gingerbread cookies. Yet here we were, the facade shattered the law, stepping into our living room on Christmas Eve. Dad finally sank back into his chair, his head in his hands. For a long time, none of us spoke. When he finally looked up, his eyes were glassy, but his voice was steady. "The truth had to come out," he said. "We could not keep living with lies." I nodded faintly, though my throat was too tight for words. The fire popped, sending a tiny spark upward, and I watched it fade into the chimney. The warmth of Christmas had been stripped away, leaving only the raw edges of what remained. The night stretched ahead of us, quiet and heavy, and I knew nothing in this family would ever look the same again. January arrived, cold and gray, the snow along the sidewalks turning to ice that cracked underfoot. The weeks after Christmas passed in a blur of court hearings, paperwork, and tense phone calls. I sat beside Dad and Aunt Caroline in the courtroom listening as the charges were read. Kristen and Mom stood together at the front, their shoulders bowed, their voices low as they admitted guilt. The judge's words carried weight, even though he spoke evenly. Probation for 36 months. Restitution of $200,000. Fines of $8,000 each. His tone softened slightly as he explained why the sentence was lighter than it could have been. First offense. Admission of guilt. A willingness to repay what they could. Still, my stomach twisted. Probation might have spared them prison time, but the humiliation was harsher than any sentence. The gallery was filled with people who knew our family, neighbors, and acquaintances, who whispered when the hearing ended. Afterward, the court arranged for their assets to be seized. I watched as the Lexus was towed from the curb, Kristen, standing at the window of her small apartment with tears streaming down her face. Later came the Rolex, the handbags, the jewelry that once sparkled under party lights. All told, $50,000 was scraped together, a fraction of what was owed. I should have felt satisfaction, but all I felt was empty. That money was meant for my future, and most of it was gone forever. Every handbag, every champagne dinner, every trip she flaunted had been bought with my chance to start fresh. One evening, Dad asked me to join him at his lawyer's office downtown. The building was old, the kind with worn carpet and heavy oak doors, but inside the air smelled of fresh coffee and leather binders. Susan Howard, his attorney, greeted me with a firm handshake. She carried a stack of documents that looked too heavy for one person. We sat around a polished table while Dad explained quietly. "I have changed my will, Claire. I need you to see it." His voice was steady, but his eyes were rimmed with exhaustion. Susan opened the file and slid the papers toward me. The words blurred at first, but then I saw them clearly. The house in Sugar House, valued at over $1.1 million. The investment accounts the real estate profits he had built over decades. Every bit of it listed under my name. I felt my throat close. "Dad, are you sure?" He leaned back, his hands folded together. "They betrayed me, Claire. They betrayed you. I cannot risk leaving anything in their hands. You are the only one I trust." A part of me wanted to argue, to tell him families should not be severed so cleanly, but the image of Mom's pale face in the courtroom and Kristen's desperate tears silenced me. They had made their choice. They had stolen what was not theirs. Susan's voice broke the quiet. "It is all legal and binding now. Unless you object, Claire, everything will transfer to you when the time comes." I nodded slowly, my fingers brushing the edge of the papers. The weight of it pressed on me, heavier than the numbers themselves. This was not a victory. It was the final confirmation that my family had splintered beyond repair. Afterward, Dad and I walked to the parking lot in silence. Snowflakes drifted around us, landing on the dark wool of his coat. He looked older than he had a month ago, the lines around his mouth deeper, his steps slower. At the car, he paused, turning to me with a sadness that pierced through his anger. "I wish it had not come to this," he said softly. I rested my hand on his arm. "So do I." Back at the house that night, I sat alone in the study, staring at the folder Susan had given me. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting long shadows on the walls. I thought about the Christmas tree still standing in the living room, the ornaments dull, now the smell of pine fading. It felt like a relic of a holiday that had ended in ashes. I read through the will again, tracing the lines with my finger. Every word reminded me of what had been lost. Not just the money, not just the trust fund that had been siphoned away, but the chance of ever sitting at that table again with my mother and sister and feeling like we were whole. The house was quiet. Too quiet. I could still hear the echoes of raised voices, the sound of Dad slamming his hand against the table, the officers leading them out into the cold. Those sounds lived inside me now, louder than the silence around me. When I finally closed the folder and set it on the desk, I knew this was permanent. The diocese of our family had been rewritten on paper, and nothing would bring it back. The inheritance was mine, the trust was gone, and all that remained was the hollow certainty that the Mitchell family name would never carry the same meaning again. The new year crept in quietly, without fireworks or champagne for me, only the cold bite of January mornings and the heavy reality of everything that had shifted in such a short span of time. Salt Lake City looked different after the holidays, streets lined with gray snowbanks, storefronts stripped of their decorations, and a silence that made me feel both lonely and ready. It was in that quiet that I decided to take the step I had dreamed of for years. I signed the lease on a small but promising storefront on Main Street, a building with tall windows that caught the light even in the dullest hours of the day. Mitchell's Charm. The name looked almost unreal, painted in gold across the glass. It felt like a promise and a challenge in one. I poured everything into that place, nearly every dollar of the $800,000 my mother had given me, the money that had not been stolen, the gift that still represented a future. Contractors came and went, painting the brick walls, installing racks, and lighting, polishing the floors until they gleamed. I stood among them each day with blueprints in my hands, making choices about fixtures and fabrics, terrified that one wrong move could collapse the entire dream. When the doors opened that March, the boutique looked like the vision I had carried for years. Dresses hung in careful order, scarves folded neatly on tables, the faint scent of lavender drifting through the air. I unlocked the doors on that first morning with my heart pounding so loudly I thought it might echo off the walls. The hours crawled by and only 3 people walked in. One bought a necklace, the rest left with polite smiles. The first months were brutal. Rent was higher than I had expected, utilities crept up, and I had 2 part-time assistants who depended on me for paychecks. Some days I rang up less than $200 in sales. At night I stayed behind, after closing, rearranging displays until my back ached, steaming dresses that no one had tried on, scribbling ideas for promotions in the margins of old notebooks. I stopped answering calls from friends in Chicago because I did not want to admit how fragile things were. One evening in April, a woman tried on a blazer and frowned at the mirror. She tugged at the hem and said the stitching looked sloppy. She left without buying it, and I locked the door that night, fighting tears. I stayed until nearly 3 in the morning, fixing the seams on every jacket in the store, determined that no one would ever find that flaw again. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, things began to change. In May, a blogger featured the boutique on her site, calling it a hidden gem downtown. A week later, a small local magazine wrote about Mitchell's Charm, praising the unique mix of local designers and imported pieces. Customers began to walk and asking for items they had seen online. I recognized a few faces, returning women who had bought a scarf or a blouse before and wanted more. Dad became my most faithful visitor. He showed up with coffee. On mornings I looked exhausted, sat in the corner reading the paper, and chatted with anyone who browsed. He told them proudly that his daughter owned the place, and more than once I caught customers smiling at his enthusiasm and staying a little longer. Aunt Caroline came by on weekends, sometimes bringing friends who always left with shopping bags, though she never let me give her a discount. Her presence steadied me. In their eyes I saw the version of family that had not been shattered, the one that had chosen honesty over betrayal. By the time summer turned to fall, Mitchell's Charm had found its rhythm. Sales grew, the register no longer felt like a burden but a lifeline, and the boutique buzzed with the sound of real customers. By September, we were breaking even. In October, a local magazine featured me as one of Salt Lake City's rising entrepreneurs. The article called Mitchell's Charm a new cornerstone of Main Street, and I clipped it out and taped it to the inside of my office drawer where I could see it whenever doubt tried to creep in. Even with the boutique thriving, the shadow of my family lingered. I tried not to think about Kristen, but news found its way to me. A neighbor mentioned in passing that she and Mom had moved into a small apartment complex on the outskirts of town, far from the tree-lined streets of Sugar House. The Lexus was gone, sold to cover debts. The handbags and jewelry had been pawned. They were scraping by living in a cramped space that held none of the glitter they once flaunted. The words sat heavy in me. I felt no triumph, no joy. It was not revenge I wanted, not really. But there was a strange kind of balance in it, a sense that the universe had corrected itself. I had not lifted a hand against them, had not shouted or plotted or cursed. Life had done the work for me. Their downfall was not my doing, but it felt like the natural consequence of their choices. I closed the shop one evening and stood in front of the window staring at my name in gold letters. The reflection of the city lights shimmered across the glass, making the letters glow as if they were burning. Behind me, the racks stood neatly filled, the counters, clean, the boutique alive in a way I once thought impossible. I thought about Mom arranging gingerbread cookies on Christmas Eve, about Kristen parading her diamond ring, about the officers leading them away under flashing lights. The images no longer filled me with the same ache. Instead, they felt distant, like a story I had heard long ago. The karma had arrived, not with my hand guiding it, but with the steady march of truth. They lived now in the shadow of their choices, and I lived in the light of my own. That night I locked the door and pulled my coat tighter against the cold, listening to the hum of the city around me. The boutique was real. The future was mine. And for the first time in a long time, I let myself believe I was exactly where I was meant to be. Morning light slid over the Wasatch and pooled on the boutique windows, and for once the day felt simple. I brewed a pot of coffee in the back room, flipped the sign to open, and stood for a quiet minute in the doorway of Mitchell's Charm. The racks were full, the floor was clean, and the air smelled faintly of lavender and paper from fresh tissue. It was not the life I imagined as a girl, yet it fit me like a good coat. I had made something that could stand on its own 2 feet. In quiet stretches, I found myself tracing the long path that led here. The flight from Chicago in winter air, the clink of silverware at a Christmas table, the shock that split a room wide open. I remembered the officer's calm voice in our living room, the sound of boots on the mat, my sister's sobs fading into the night. Those sounds had lost their sharp edge. They lived in me, but they no longer owned me. Dad kept his promise to drop by most mornings. He would shuffle in with a paper cup of coffee, look around like a proud foreman, and ask what needed fixing. Sometimes it was a loose hanger bar or a stubborn light bulb. Sometimes he would simply sit near the fitting area and talk to customers about their grandkids or their winter vacations, and somehow they would stay longer and buy more. Aunt Caroline came on Saturdays wearing bright scarves and an energy that lifted the whole room. She told me once that survival is a muscle and that ours had grown strong. I believed her. The legal part settled into routine. Every few weeks, a statement arrived that showed a small restitution payment posted against the large balance. I did not celebrate those envelopes, and I did not dread them either. They were facts like snowfall and tax bills, proof that consequences keep time, even when feelings try to run ahead or fall behind. We learned from a neighbor that Mom and Kristen had moved again, this time to a smaller apartment near a strip of older storefronts and a laundromat. It was the kind of place you passed by without noticing. I pictured them putting plates in a new cabinet, the clatter echoing too loudly in a room that did not yet feel like home. In late autumn, I saw Kristen for the first time since the hearing. I was leaving the boutique with a bag of returns when she stepped out of the grocery store across the street. She was thinner, her hair pulled back, no ring, and no glittering bracelet. For a second, we both froze. She lifted a hand in a small, uncertain wave. I walked over because turning away felt like a kind of lie. She spoke first, her voice small. "I heard your store is doing well." I said that it was steady, and that I was grateful. She stared at the sidewalk and said she had a line on a job at a cafe near their apartment. I told her I hoped she would take it. We stood in that awkward space where the past keeps trying to pull you backward. She apologized again, softer this time, not a plea, just the words themselves. I told her I accepted the apology and that I needed space. She nodded like she had expected that answer. When we parted, she said to stay warm, and I said the same. I walked back to the boutique with a strange mix of sorrow and relief. Forgiveness, I learned, is not the same as reunion. Sometimes it is the gift that lets you walk in a straight line. Mom wrote a letter around Thanksgiving. The envelope carried her careful handwriting, the same loops I had seen on lunch notes in grade school. She said she was working part-time filing records at a clinic, and that the work steadied her. She said she had been proud of me even when she did not say it out loud. She also wrote that she wished she had been stronger when it mattered. I sat at my kitchen table and read the letter twice. I felt tenderness for the girl my mother once was and the woman she had become. I wrote back 2 days later. I told her about Dad's coffee stops and Aunt Caroline's scarves, and the day the magazine photographer came to the store. I said I hoped we would find a careful way forward with boundaries we could both keep. I did not write about Christmas. I wanted to save that choice for a day when I could make it without flinching. Winter returned, and the city put on its coat of lights again. On a clear afternoon in December, Dad and I unpacked a box of ornaments in the boutique and decorated a small tree by the window. He hung the little wooden sled I used to claim for my own when I was 8. I placed the silver frame I had given my parents years ago on the counter, the one with the 3 of us smiling in front of the old house. The photograph looked like a promise kept from another lifetime. It did not hurt to look at it anymore. I made new rituals. On Fridays, I closed an hour early and took a long walk around the block to breathe in the cold. On Sundays, Aunt Caroline and I cooked simple dinners at Dad's house, stews and cornbread and pies that made the kitchen smell like safety. We talked about books and neighbors and the headlines. Sometimes we spoke of Mom and Kristen, not in anger, but in the plain language of family as it exists now. We did not erase them. We simply put them in a place that did not harm us. The boutique kept growing. A local reporter filmed a short segment about women-owned businesses in the city, and I stood in front of the tree and tried not to look nervous while a camera crew wove around the racks. Customers sent notes about how the store felt welcoming, about how the dress they bought made them confident at a reunion or a job interview. Those notes meant more to me than the sales reports. They were proof that something good can grow where something painful once stood. On a quiet night a week before Christmas, I closed up and lingered in the doorway the way I did on my first day. The street hummed with traffic farther off, and somewhere up the block a bus sighed at a stop. Snow began to fall in thin, slow flakes that drifted rather than dropped. The world felt soft around the edges. I thought about the Christmas that had broken us open, and about the year that followed a year, spent piecing myself back together with honest hands. Justice had not been loud. It had been steady. It had moved like the seasons. It took away the glitter that was never real and left behind what mattered. Dad called to ask if I needed a ride home. I said I was fine and that I would see him Sunday. He said he was proud of me. I told him I knew, and I did. I locked the door and tucked my keys in my pocket, feeling the ordinary heft of them. Ordinary had become my favorite kind of miracle. I do not know what the future holds for my mother and sister. I hope they find work that gives them dignity and friends who tell them the truth. I hope they sit in quiet kitchens and learn to listen to the stillness. I hope they keep their promises, especially the ones they make to themselves. As for me, I will keep opening the door each morning and greeting whoever walks in. I will keep naming prices and hemming hems and steaming dresses. I will keep building a life that answers to my own name. If there is a lesson I carry into every new day, it is this: betrayal cuts deep, and it can break a family in ways you cannot predict. But truth does not stop for anyone. It moves through rooms like winter air, and it clears what it must. When the air settles, you are left with what you chose to build. I chose work and honesty and a small tree by a window. I chose to love the people who stood with me and to step back from the people who did not. There is peace in that. A quiet kind of courage that does not need an audience. Betrayal from family cuts the deepest, especially during the holidays. Have you ever experienced it? Share your story in the comments.